Hi everyone, welcome to my first ever punch needle tutorial, my first ever online tutorial. So please be gentle with me, I'm going to try my best. So if you're watching this video, you've most likely purchased one of my kits, and I've directed you to this video. If you haven't bought one of my kits, that's absolutely fine, you're more than welcome. However, I will just say that the tutorial I'm giving today is based specifically for the equipment that you would get in one of my kits. So the exact yarn that we're going to use, the exact backing fabric, the exact needle. So if you haven't bought one of my kits, just to say these tips and tricks might not work with the equipment that you're using. They might still do and you might still learn something. So feel free to still watch along. So if you have bought one of my kits, so the first thing we're going to do is put our backing fabric into our hoop. So you're going to unscrew your hoop, place the inner hoop down on your flat surface, place your fabric over the top, position it kind of in the middle so you've got a nice space around the edge, even spacing. And then put your outer hoop on top. Now you can see, or you will be able to see, very small the lines of the the fabric, the way it's woven. So you ideally want the lines to be going horizontally and vertically, just to make things a bit easier. So when that is on place, turn it over. And you start to tighten the fabric just by pulling gently around all the edges. Now whilst you're doing this, you want to pinch the two pieces of wood with both fingers. If you don't and you pull too hard, it's just going to come apart again, which is really frustrating. So put it together. Make sure the lines are even. So this is when you're going to use your screwdriver and just start to tighten the hoop slightly. And then again you're going to go round and tighten it as much as you possibly can. I'm sorry if I keep knocking the tripod. I've actually got one of my hands in between the tripod legs, which is a bit awkward, but it just gave me the best angle for filming this. So once you've gone all the way around, you then tighten it a little bit more. And keep stretching. You might find it easier to lay it flat and do it this way. And again, keep the inner ring pushed down so that it doesn't pop out of place. And you'll be amazed how much more it actually stretches. Tighten it a little bit more and keep going with that process. And the aim is to have the fabric as tight as you possibly can. If you've watched other punch needle tutorials, you'll hear people saying that you need it as tight as a drum. So that's kind of what you're aiming for. You may also see people using non-slip hoops, which I do use as well, but obviously in the kits they're an extra cost. You would have to purchase one of those as well. So these work perfectly fine. You just have to get the material nice and tight. And one of the reasons I cut my fabric quite large compared to the hoop is for this reason. You want to be able to get a good grip on the fabric to be able to pull it really tightly. This fabric is quite delicate. It's a linen mixed fabric, and it's only happened once, but one time when I'd completely finished a an embroidery, got to the stage of stretching it on the hoop, and then my finger went through it and it ripped. So having this extra fabric around the outside and giving you a lot to kind of grip on, it helps, rather than having to sort of get your fingers in there. I think it was my thumb that kind of went straight through it. It's very frustrating. So having quite a lot of fabric hopefully prevents this from happening. And then you can kind of tighten it as much as you can. Lay your fabric over the pattern. Now, because the Sharpie that I've got is a little bit thick, and because it's silver, it's not actually brilliant. So I'm going to use my aqua marker, but if you've got a thinner Sharpie, then that'll work perfectly fine, or any other permanent marker. So draw over your pattern. And again, if you can't see the pattern very clearly, then you can do this against a window, but obviously on a flat surface it is slightly easier in some ways. You can then move your pattern out of the way, and you've got your hoop ready to go. We're actually going to punch from the back. Obviously drawing the pattern is easier that way because the fabric is flat against the table. If you were trying to draw it that way, obviously you wouldn't be against the surface and it would be harder to draw. However, when you're actually punching, to do it inside the hoop is a bit more awkward. So I always do it on the flat side where the fabric is flat against the hoop on the outside, and you punch through to the other side. If you feel comfortable punching from this side and you feel like you can see the pattern clearly enough, then that's absolutely fine. If you want to, you can take the fabric out, flip it over and re-stretch it. The only problem with doing that is that it's hard to get the pattern exactly the same. Obviously for this practice one, it doesn't really matter, you know, the heart doesn't have to be perfectly shaped, but for any other patterns, it will be more important. So it's quite difficult to re-stretch because you stretch the fabric so much, it's hard to get it exactly the same. And if you drew the circle around the outside, you would realise just how difficult it is to try and get that perfect circle again. It doesn't really happen. So I'm going to punch from this side. Hopefully you can still see the pattern. But as I say, if you want to punch from this side, then you can. Okay, so your punch needle will come with 3 different sized needles, which is brilliant for using different size yarns, threads. I call it thread, most people call it yarn, so that's why I'm using both words. So if you're using a thicker thread, a lot of people use rug wool, and that will need a much larger needle like this. So for this tutorial and for most of my patterns that I use at the moment, we're going to use the medium sized needle, so the one that's in the middle in width. Does that make sense? So this is one we're going to be using today. So you can put the other 2 aside and you can experiment with those at a later date. So before we thread the needle, we have to set the needle length. So this punch needle that I'm using, the Lavore punch needle, if that's how it's pronounced, is adjustable. So it can create different length loops, which can create lots of different effects, and that's why it's really, really useful. And you can be really creative with it. But it just means that, yeah, you have to adjust the needle length. We're going to do 2 centimeters in length. So if you keep your finger away from this part here that obviously tightens and loosens the needle and makes the needle be able to move up and down freely. So if you keep your finger away from that so that you can still grab that with the other hand, then that's useful. So we're going to set the needle to 2 centimeters, and you do have to be quite exact about this because sometimes, it's only happened to me once, but sometimes when you're punching, the clasp can come loose, the needle can fall down, and then if you're halfway through a piece and you haven't set it on a specific length, or you haven't remembered what that length was, then the loops are going to be different sizes, which you don't want. It's going to look uneven. So set it to the exact length that you want, It's a little bit awkward, but you get used to it. And then the reason I say to keep your finger away from here is because you can then tighten it, and tighten it as much as you can. Okay, when it's tight, check the length hasn't moved, 2 centimetres, and that's what we want it for today. Now, my other little tip is to keep this part of the needle the most open side. So you've got the back of the needle that's just got the tiny little hole that the thread goes through. The front of the needle, you've got the larger hole. So you now have got your needle to the exact length that you want, which for today is 2 centimetres. Now, what I do is keep the front of the needle, so I'm going to call this part the front of the needle just to make it easier, and this is the back of the needle. If you keep the front of the needle lined up with this, the screw that keeps the needle tight, if you keep those two in line, it's going to help you, and I'll show you why once we get started. So the next thing we're going to do is thread the needle. Find my threader. Your threader might not look exactly like this, but it's going to do the same job. So you're going to go in through the back of the needle, which is this tiny hole here. So you're going to thread through there. Now, if you want to, you can put your finger over the other side, and that's to stop it coming out that way, because what we want it to do is go down the inside of the needle. So you can put your finger over to cover to prevent that happening. Put it in a little eye at the back. Make sure it's going down the needle, and you're going to go all the way down until you see it coming out the other end. Then you're going to grab your yarn or your thread, put it through the loop at the end, hold on to it a little bit just so it doesn't fall out, and then you're going to pull on the end. That's why it's got the sticker on. Pull the other end and it'll come up the needle and it'll come out the back. Okay, and then your thread is going to move freely. Okay, so we are now ready to start doing some punch needle. We've got our fabric onto our hoop nice and tightly. Just give it a last check that it's quite tight. You can always adjust this as you go along. If it starts to get loose, which it will do, you can just put it tighter again. You've got your needle that is threaded. Double check that your needle is still the length that you want it to be, 2 centimetres. And it's a good tip to keep checking this as you go along. Occasionally the needle slips down slightly, and then once you turn the piece over, you'll see that the loops are different lengths, which you don't want. You want to keep them all at the same length. So make sure that's nice and tight, and you're ready to go.